100 to 500 with teleconverters, or the 200 to 800mm lens? That's a question a lot of us Canon shooters will be asking ourselves going forward. So is the unique versatility and the L-label designation of the 100 to 500mm lens worth the extra cost? Or does the amazing reach of the 200 to 800mm lens trump everything else? Let's answer that question for you today. While on paper these two lenses sound somewhat similar, side by side they're very different. The 100 to 500mm lens is significantly smaller and lighter. In fact, the fully extended 100 to 500mm lens is about the same length as the fully collapsed 200 to 800mm lens. So when it comes to size and weight and traveling with the lenses, fitting them into your backpack and hand-holding in the field, the 100 to 500mm lens has definitely an advantage. While neither of the lenses has an Arca Swiss style foot, on the 100 to 500mm lens you can actually remove the lens collar and the lens foot, making the lens even smaller and lighter, whereas on the 200 to 800mm lens, unfortunately you can't remove that quite big and bulky lens foot and tripod collar. Both of these lenses are quite unique in their own way, and I love seeing Canon innovate in this space, because rather than giving us the sort of traditional lenses we're used to, Canon has pushed the boundaries with both of these lenses, giving them a unique place in the market. Of course, we're paying for that with slightly slower f-stops, but in today's world where we have cameras that can use really high ISOs, having slightly slower lenses but more focal length actually makes a lot of sense to me, because ultimately we can denoise our images, but if we don't have enough focal length, it's a lot harder to work with in the field. The 100 to 500mm lens is an L series lens, which is Canon's top of the line range with the best coatings, the best weather sealings and the best materials used. The 200 to 800mm lens, on the other hand, has also the white paint, but is not an L series lens, which means that there's some drawbacks when it comes to image quality and weather sealing. I've soaked that 100 to 500mm lens with and without teleconverters a fair few times in the field, and thus far it has always survived. But of course, whenever I come home, I make sure that I dry the lens completely and let it dry overnight, fully extended. So while both of these lenses seem to be somewhat weather resistant at least, I wouldn't really want to get either of them too wet, and if I can, I avoid it. Oftentimes in the field, if it's raining very hard, I put my t-shirt on the lens, for instance, to try and keep it a little bit more dry. Or when I zoom back, for instance, I often try to quickly dry the lens barrel so I don't suck in too much water into the lens. But all in all, thus far, both of these lenses seem to be weather protected quite well, even though the 100 to 500mm lens should give us an edge in the field being fully weather sealed, so we can have a little bit more of a peace of mind. The 100 to 500mm lens comes equipped with a fully functional manual focus ring and a separate control ring, whereas on the 200 to 800mm lens we can only find one ring, and via a switch on the lens you can either make that the manual focus ring or the control ring. Personally, I don't use the control rings, but if you're someone that uses the control rings on a camera like an R8 for instance that doesn't have the 3 wheels on the camera, you might find the 200 to 800mm lens quite limiting in that regard. The front element of the 100 to 500mm lens is the very common 77mm, and on the 200 to 800mm lens we find the more uncommon 95mm. Neither of these lenses is going to be ideal when it comes to intense low light shooting in dark environments, but at the same time I think that the impact of the slow f-stops is a way overblown topic. I've used both of these lenses, and especially the 100 to 500mm lens, routinely in the dark rainforest, and I've always gotten some fantastic results. Of course, I had to use higher ISOs than on an f2.8 lens for instance, but at the same time I was getting much better depth of field and I was still getting good enough results. And with today's workflow where we have my Pro sets and DxO Puro 3 for instance and my Masterclass workflow, I'm able to still get fantastic results even at these very high ISO levels with these rather slow lenses. So if I had to rank these two lenses when it comes to low light photography, it's pretty much a draw between the two. Another interesting question with the rather slow f-stops on these lenses is the background blur, and overall both of these lenses do pretty well. Neither of them looks like a f4 600mm prime lens for instance, but all in all both of these deliver nice and smooth autofocus backgrounds, with the 200 to 800mm lens especially on the long end actually delivering slightly more smooth and autofocus backgrounds than the 100 to 500 and also the 100 to 500mm lens with the extenders. So in that regard, the 200 to 800mm lens has a slight edge. And the difference becomes even more apparent if you're shooting the 100 to 500mm lens at 500mm and the 800mm lens at 800mm, because then the amount of what you see in the background can be quite different. The surprisingly good low-light performance of the two lenses is also aided by the fact that they both come with fantastic image stabilization. Now the 100 to 500mm lens, especially on the R3 and the R5, probably has some of the best, if not the best, long lens image stabilization in the Canon lineup. But the 200 to 800mm lens has actually surprised me in that area because it has much better than expected image stabilization that is very close to the 100 to 500mm lens. On the long end, and especially once you add teleconverters to the 100 to 500mm lens, the 200 to 800mm lens actually now has the better image stabilization. It just seems like that once you add the teleconverters to the 100 to 500mm lens, that the image stabilization takes a hit, and handheld video, for instance, becomes a little bit more shaky. And of course, later in this video, we will also talk about the performance with teleconverters a bit more in detail. One of the biggest differences between the two lenses is the minimum focusing distance. The 100 to 500mm lens can basically act as an emergency macro lens with an amazing minimum focusing distance of just 1.2 meters or 3.9 feet at the 500mm mark, whereas the 200 to 800mm lens comes in at 3.3 meters or 10.8 feet at the 800mm mark. So even though you have more focal length on the 200 to 800mm lens, the 100 to 500mm lens actually gives you more magnification on your subject simply because you can get so much closer to it in the field. When photographing out in the bush, I didn't find the minimum focusing distance of the 200 to 800mm lens to be an issue at all, but if you know that you can get very close to your subjects on a regular basis, you might find the smaller minimum focusing distance of the 100 to 500mm lens to be a bit of an advantage. If you're out and about though and you can't really get that close to your animals on a consistent basis, it pretty much doesn't matter for you at all. And whether you use the 100 to 500mm lens or the 200 to 800mm lens, one of the best ways to get better results is to learn image editing. And I would love to help you to get more confident and better at image editing with my masterclass and my Pro sets. With my Pro sets, I allow you with just one click to transform your RAW files with amazing results. And in my masterclass, I teach you everything you need to know in Photoshop step by step so you can follow along and get amazing results yourself. So if that sounds interesting to you, make sure to check this out down there in the description. Now I have to admit that the 100 to 500mm lens is definitely one of my favorite lenses of all times, exactly because it's so small and versatile. I can shoot at 100mm, get amazing birdscapes, I can do close-ups, but that's not even it. I can also add the teleconverters to it and then essentially have one lens that allows me to shoot from 100 to 1000mm still with amazing image quality. So that's pretty cool if you ask me. The biggest difference between the two lenses can be found on the wide end, and it's quite significant. While on paper, it doesn't sound that much to go from 100 to 200mm, but in the field, there's worlds between those two focal lengths. There have been numerous occasions over the years where I was able to get a beautiful bird and habitat kind of shot because I was able to zoom out all the way to 100mm. Had I tried to do the same shot with a 200mm lens, it would have simply not been possible because oftentimes you'd have to walk so far back with the 200mm lens trying to get the bird small enough in the frame that you then have a lot of other elements kind of between you and the bird, just not giving you the same angle and the same feel you can get at that 100mm focal length. Of course, we can't always get close to our subjects on a regular basis, and if you mainly use your 100 to 500mm lens on the long end, it can quickly start to feel quite short, especially on a full frame camera. 500mm is definitely not a lot when it comes to wildlife and especially smaller bird photography. Now, of course, you can add teleconverters to the 100 to 500mm lens to get a bit of extra reach, and I told you above already that they work quite well. But at the same time, if you add teleconverters to the 100 to 500, it actually becomes quite a different lens. Because the once great versatility and zoom range is now rather limited, because with the 1.4 extender, the lens can only zoom from 420 to 700mm, and with the 2x extender, you're limited to a range from 600 to 1000mm. So ironically, if you add teleconverters to the 100 to 500mm lens, the 200 to 800mm lens is actually now much wider, starting at 200mm rather than the 100 to 500mm lens starting at 420mm. So suddenly the 200 to 800mm lens actually has quite an edge. And even if you add the teleconverters to the 200 to 800mm lens, it still stays wider than the 100 to 500mm lens. And if you intend to leave the teleconverters on the 100 to 500mm lens basically all the time, it's now also quite big when you want to store it away in your backpack and essentially the same size as the 200 to 800mm lens. And this is where the 200 to 800mm lens showcases its main and unique strength, the ability to zoom all the way to 800mm without using any teleconverters in a relatively small, lightweight and not too expensive package. You can basically not find that in any other lens currently available on the market. So especially if one of these two lenses is going to be your main telephoto lens, the ease of use is one aspect that cannot be ignored and definitely favors the 200 to 800mm lens. When it comes to the image quality, especially when you can get close to your subject, the 100 to 500mm lens is very hard to beat, and I didn't expect the 200 to 800mm lens to do so. That lens also has more high-end coatings, which allows you to get cleaner images when there's a lot of bright areas in your photos. When photographing with the 200 to 800mm lens in the field, I was surprised how nice and sharp and detailed the images were. So in that regard, especially in terms of sharpness, the lens is excellent. But when it came to the image quality overall, I noticed a lack of some of these coatings because that lens is simply a little bit more affected by bright areas in your images, having some fringing and some haziness going over the edges of these bright areas. And in general, the 100 to 500 just gives me a slightly cleaner image. But I think the 200 to 800mm lens is actually surprisingly close in most situations and would make most people very happy. The main thing I have to watch in the field is that I underexpose a little bit more to make sure that I maintain detail and not get too much flaring in these bright areas. Even though the 100 to 500mm lens has the better overall image quality, I would prefer a full frame shot with the 200 to 800mm lens at 800mm over a shot taken with the 100 to 500mm lens at 500mm and then crop to the 800mm point of view. Cropping that much degrades image quality to such a degree that now the 200 to 800mm lens delivers the better shot and also gives us a lot more pixel on our subject. After all, the 200 to 800mm lens has 60% more reach than the bare 100 to 500mm lens in the field, which definitely shows if you can't get too close to your subjects. If you can get close enough to your subjects without having to crop a lot, the bare 100 to 500mm lens definitely has an advantage. But if you have to crop a lot or use the teleconverters on the 100 to 500mm lens, then things become a lot more unclear and the two lenses move a lot closer together. Once we put the 1.4 teleconverter on the 100 to 500mm lens, the difference between the two lenses is now only 14%. So the 200 to 800mm lens still maintains a slight edge when it comes to the focal length. The difference between f9 to f10 wide open between these two lenses now is basically negligible. When it comes to image quality and sharpness, once we attach the 1.4 extender to the 100 to 500mm lens and shoot from the same shooting distance, the two images now look very similar. To see the differences, you actually have to do some quite intensive pixel peeping, and I would argue that most people wouldn't really notice the difference in the field. And there's other factors like heat haze, for instance, that will affect your photos and the sharpness and image quality a lot more than the difference between the two lenses. To make things even more interesting, we can also zoom back the 200 to 800mm lens to 700mm because it's slightly sharper zoom back than at the very long end. And then if we compare it to the 100 to 500mm lens with the 1.4 extender attached, it might have an ever so slight edge now, even though I still find it hard to tell a difference between the two when it comes to proper shooting in the field. One important area for us photographers is always the autofocus, and I give a slight edge here to the 100 to 500mm lens. When you use it in the field, it just seems to be a little bit smoother and a little bit faster. The 200 to 800 is definitely good and fast enough, but overall the 100 to 500mm lens just grabs the subject a bit fast and also seems to stick to it a little bit better. So while I had some fantastic birds and flight shots with both lenses, overall it was a little bit smoother and easier to work on the 100 to 500mm lens. This is also aided by the fact that the zoom and the throw on the 100 to 500mm lens is much smoother and much shorter. The fairly long and stiff zoom on the 200 to 800mm lens definitely makes it a little bit more difficult to use in the field, especially when it comes to birds and action photography, where you sometimes have to move out to find the subject and then quickly zoom back in. Now you could also just sort of pull on the end of the lens to get it out quicker, but even then it still somewhat feels a little bit stiff and doesn't flow super smooth like it does on the 100 to 500mm lens. Overall, I think the performance of both of these lenses is very good. The 100 to 500 has a more visible edge when you don't use the extenders and are able to get close to your subject, but once your subject is a little bit further away and you have to use teleconverters on the 100 to 500mm lens, the lenses become a lot more similar. When I was photographing the crested tern colony the other day, I was perfectly confronted with the strengths and weaknesses of both lenses. The 200 to 800mm shined when it came to close-up slow motion flight shots and beautiful intimate shots of the terns with their little babies all the way zoomed into the colony, but at the same time the lens lacked the ability to zoom out far enough to show the whole beautiful scenery with the sunset and the ocean background. And this is where the 100 to 500mm lens shined, because it allowed me to show more of the whole beautiful scenery and the sunset with the terns combined. Now one could easily say that it's the better choice to use the 100 to 500 with the teleconverters, because you have the slightly better image quality, the more versatile lens, and you get close to the 800mm of the 200 to 800mm lens. But that ignores the fact that you can also use teleconverters on the 200 to 800mm lens, giving you some crazy reach of 1120mm with the 1.4 extenders and 1600mm with the 2x extenders. And even though you're quite limited by the f-stops, you're still getting some very good image quality with the extenders on the 200 to 800mm lens. One advantage of the 200 to 800mm lens over the 100 to 500mm lens with the 1.4 extender is that the 200 to 800mm lens has the full coverage of the whole EVF with all your autofocusing points, whereas the 100 to 500mm lens has a slightly more limited autofocusing area available once you use extenders on it. If you attach a 2x extender though, then the roles are reversed and the 200 to 800mm lens now has a significantly reduced autofocusing area. So when it comes to ultimate reach, the 200 to 800mm lens definitely maintains its edge, because the 100 to 500mm lens taps out at 1000mm and the 200 to 800mm lens can get you to 1600mm. When I was photographing the pink robin the other day, I was actually able to use both lenses side by side with the teleconverters attached, and I got some quite interesting and stunning results. You may be a little bit surprised that the size of the robin in the frame with the 100 to 500mm lens is almost the same as with the 200 to 800mm lens, even though I had a lot less focal length. But because the bird was so tame, I could actually get much closer to the robin because of the lower minimum focusing distance of the 100 to 500mm lens, allowing me to match the size in the frame a little bit more. When it comes to the image quality, the 100 to 500 with the 2x extender gives me a slightly sharper and cleaner photo. Both photos are somewhat similar, but when it comes to the pure image quality and sharpness, I give a little bit of an edge to the 100 to 500mm lens. Now, I wouldn't really recommend using the 2x extender all the time on the 200 to 800mm lens or the 100 to 500mm lens for that matter, but if you can get close to your subject, you can get some amazing results. Where the difference in focal length with the extenders will show a lot more is obviously if your subject is a little bit further away. And in these cases, having that extra reach with the 200 to 800mm lens can be crucial at times. And if we compare both of the lenses with the 1.4 extender attached, I think the image quality and sharpness overall are almost identical. Now, if we try to match the size of the bird in the frame, the 200 to 800mm lens would obviously win, because we would have to crop quite substantially on the 700mm shot. Some of you might also be interested how these two lenses compare to the EF 100 to 400mm lens with the 2x extender attached, giving us 800mm and f11. And I think both of these lenses deliver better results than the 100 to 400 with the 2x extender attached. I've used the 100 to 500 and the 200 to 800 also on different camera bodies, and results are basically the same. They all work very well on the top of the line bodies like the R3, the R5, R6 Mark II, and also quite well on the other bodies. And on some of the bodies like the R7 and the R10 that have some known autofocusing struggles, both of the lenses also had some issues with these cameras when it comes to autofocusing consistency. So it wasn't like the R7 was much better on the 100 to 500 compared to the 200 to 800. I basically encountered the same pros and cons with each camera body on both of these lenses. Interestingly, if we combine the R7 with the 100 to 500mm lens, we get an effective focal length of 800mm. And if we put an R5 on the 200 to 800mm lens, we're also getting an effective focal length of 800mm. And if we compare the two, I would probably give now a slight edge to the R5 and the 200 to 800mm lens, simply because the autofocus is a bit more sticky and more consistent. So I will end up with a lot more in focus and sharp photos compared to the R7 and the 100 to 500mm lens. Now, that's not saying that the R7 doesn't work well on these lenses. It definitely does, and you can get some amazing images, and you can even put it on the 200 to 800mm lens and get an amazing 1280mm of reach. But overall, the consistency with both of these lenses was lacking a little bit when it came to the autofocus on the R7. Am I going to dump my 100 to 500mm lens in favor of the 200 to 800mm lens now? No. The 100 to 500 is by far the most flexible and versatile lens I've ever used, and it's also so easy to travel with alongside my big f4 600mm prime lens. The 200 to 800mm will be a great addition to my lineup, but it can't replace the 100 to 500mm lens for me because it's too long on the short end. And personally, I use that short end of the 100 to 500mm lens a fair bit for photography in the field, but also a lot for filming. And so I wouldn't want to give that up. However, that's my specific use case, and that may be very different to you. I also own that big f4 600mm prime lens, so flexibility, small size, and versatility become more important to me than, for instance, if this is your only telephoto lens. So if you currently own a 100 to 500mm lens and use it mainly on the long end, and especially with the teleconverters as well, or you're looking for a new lens that's going to be your main telephoto lens, one could easily make the case that the 200 to 800mm lens is an excellent, if not better choice, simply because it's so easy to zoom in and out, and it gets you all the way to 800mm without having the hassle of dealing with any teleconverters at all. And if you want to deal with the teleconverter, you can add the 1.4 teleconverter to that lens and get over 1000 millimeters of reach, which is pretty amazing. I also think the 200 to 800mm lens could be an excellent and well-priced choice for many people who are currently using a Sigma or Tamron 150 to 600mm lens, because you get more focal length, much better autofocus, and much better image stabilization. So going forward, I'll definitely be using that 200 to 800mm lens a fair bit in the field alongside my 100 to 500mm lens. So whenever I feel like the 100 to 500mm lens is too short and I don't want to carry or drag around my big heavy f4 600mm lens, the 200 to 800mm lens will fit in perfectly because it's easy enough to handle, easy enough to walk around, and I can still kind of stay a little bit more hidden than if I was standing in a busy park with my big 600mm prime lens where a lot of people would walk up to me and talk to me, whereas with that 200 to 800mm lens, it's just small enough that most people still ignore you. If the 100 to 500 or 200 to 800mm lens is better suited for you, comes down to whether you value size and flexibility more or the ultimate reach. The 200 to 800mm lens finally gives us amazing reach in a small and well-priced package. So which one is it gonna be for you? Make sure to let me know in the comments, give me a thumbs up for the video, check out my channel membership, and hit that subscribe button, and I will see you in the next video very soon. Bye guys.